I want to welcome you to a very special session of Growing Kids God's Way. Obviously, we're in a slightly different format here in the church. You could look around and see a number of poinsettias because it's Christmas time. And if you would be joining us a little later on, and it's July, we want to say Merry Christmas to you folks. But this is a special season. This is the season in which we move to remembrance. This is a season in which we recall what the Lord has done, even as we move beyond Christmas to the end of the year. And what I want to share with you is something that is not just seasonal. It is a message that is appropriate for this season, but it goes far beyond. I want to talk to you this evening, and you can follow along in your notes. I want to talk to you in this session about a concept that God introduced to the Israelites many years ago that was carried through the New Testament, but somewhere in the first century church it was lost. It's not that what I'm going to share with you is the introduction of a lost doctrine, certainly not that, but it's to take a review of a concept that God gave to man, and it's a concept called memorials. In fact, I want to start in Deuteronomy chapter 4. I want to read one verse to you, if I may. Backdrop is that there's a new generation being taught the greatness of God's law. In verse 1, Moses is instructing Israel now to listen to the statutes and judgments. He goes through and talks about all that God has done. And now he moves to verse 9, and this is what he says. Only Israel, take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and your children's grandchildren. That is the instruction that is given to us. Take heed of yourselves, he says. Take heed of yourselves and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen. I want to talk to you in this session about this concept of memorials. Basically, if we were to define memorials, it simply means this: to remember. To remember. Write that down as a definition. And you can add to that definition. To remember what? Well, in the biblical context of how God used it, it's this: to remember to tell the story again. Every place where God introduced the concept of memorials, it was given for one purpose: tell the story again. In fact, let me just give you some examples from the Old Testament. I'll start with one of the more popular examples, Joshua chapter 4, 4 through 7. Let me read this to you. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God in the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulders according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in times to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is the children of Israel. They are now planted on the east side of the Jordan. They have been wandering for 40 years. The promise is being fulfilled. They're about to cross over to the west side of the Jordan. The instructions are to take up the stones from the east side and put them on the west side. And the reason that they're going to be there is because they're going to be a memorial forever to the children of Israel. Now, you have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, what you have here is a scene. And to put it into a proper context and into the national heritage here, we need to understand that the Israelites were not a group of people, they were not a nation of people that would just drop the stones and walk off. Ladies and gentlemen, there was something rather significant in the history of Israel in this moment. And I would dare say, although the text never really speaks to it, I would dare say that those stones were maintained. That is, maybe there was a little park put around. I'm sure up the road there were even signs as people would come down to look at the crossing. And maybe the signs would read a half a day's walk to the crossing or a day's walk to the crossing. These stones were so significant, but their purpose is even more significant. God gives us memorials because He understands very clearly that man, you and I, have a tendency to forget the things that our eyes have seen. That's why He gives them. And He says every time that your children come asking, saying, what do these stones mean? Tell the story again. Tell the story of bondage. Tell the story of captivity. Tell the story of redemption by blood over the doorpost. Tell the story of God's mighty work. Tell the story how God delivered the children of Israel from the army of Pharaoh. Tell the story about sin in the wilderness. Tell the story again. Tell the story of deliverance and God's faithfulness. Tell the story again. Every time you see those stones, tell the story again. And that's the whole purpose. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to go back to the beginning in Exodus 3:15, God gives His very name as a memorial to all generations. Basically, if we go back to that text, and I want to turn there just for a moment to look at it, in Exodus 3:15, actually it starts in 13, a conversation's going on between Moses and God, and this is where we pick it up in verse 13. Then Moses said to God, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they say to me, 'What is His name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And He said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" Moreover, God said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations.'" In fact, what God is doing here, ladies and gentlemen, is pledging His name, pledging Himself to be unchanging from generation to generation. We all are very familiar with the fact that I am is one of the more prominent names of God. May I introduce in this text the second name that He declares. The second name of God is I am, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That trilogy, those three names, simply means this: I am the God that is unchanging from generation to generation to generation. I pledge myself faithful from generation to generation to generation. This is the first introduction of memorials in the Old Testament. But just a few pages, if you turn over to Exodus chapter 12, there's another significant moment in the history of Israel. We talked about it just a moment ago when in fact, Israel was being delivered on that very night. There was redemption by blood. Picking up in verse 12 of chapter 12 of Exodus, we have here, ladies and gentlemen, the events of the Passover. "For I will pass," this is what is recorded, "I will pass through the land of Egypt on the night, and will strike all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance." In this particular passage, God declares the events of the Passover as to be a memorial to all generations. He said, what is going to happen in this night is so important to the history of Israel and to the plan of redemption. I don't ever want you to forget it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to institute a feast day every year, and to this very day it is still celebrated. Every year you will celebrate the Passover. What for? What is the purpose of this memorial? Tell the story again. That's the purpose. That's why God gives us memorials. That's why He introduced them to the nation of Israel. It was actually carried through in Exodus 17, 9 through 14. He gives a personal memorial unto Joshua to remind him where his victories come from. You could study that text. He also carries it into the New Testament, Matthew 26:13. Jesus gives a memorial of sacrifice. You'll remember in this particular scene in Matthew 26:13, in that particular text, that Mary is the one who broke the vial of costly perfume to prepare His body. There was squabbling over it, and Jesus said, wherever this gospel is preached, I want this memorial of sacrifice to be shared along with the gospel message. This is the memorial of sacrifice. Acts 10, 1 through 5. The continuing seeking prayer of Cornelius was a memorial unto God. You could read through that text. Again, that word and the concept is coming back to us. It is to be a reminder that God even remembers. He hears the prayers of those who are earnestly seeking Him. The text is full of this. The concept that God gave us memorials for one reason. He doesn't want us to forget because He knows we do forget. We do forget. I want to take this very simple concept. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring it right home to you by using some illustrations about the Ezzo family. Ultimately, this is going to be the clearest representation of what God has done in our life. But I think that you can take our name out And you could put your name in many of the things I'm about to share with you. And I want you to do that. I want to share with you some of the great spiritual markers, some of the memorials in our life. And I want you to see how they apply to your life, how important they are, and why these are memorials in our life. Let me begin with the very first one. These are what I would call the miracles in the Ezzo family. That miracles that have no other explanation, that there was a sovereign act of God. And the first one is this. The first memorial we have is the memorial of God's faithfulness for your faithfulness or for our faithfulness. The memorial of God's faithfulness for our faithfulness. What God gives back to us. Many years ago, when Anne-Marie and I were just puppy Christians, we were involved in a very small church in New England, and we had opportunity to be in a church that supported a missionary that was home. And for 4 nights, this missionary came and spoke on the life of faith. Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. He gave us these messages on the life of faith that so challenged us. Now, I want you to know that the figures I'm going to give you some financial figures, they go back to the early 70s, so they certainly will be out of context for today. But I want you to understand it for the significance of the story here. I got paid on Friday for my job. And we had a home, and like you, we attempted to pay off the big bill first, which is always the mortgage, and you end up with just a little bit left in your checking account. And we would pay everything off. We were diligent about that. That left us just a very little bit of money to get through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, until Friday came again. We finished up 4 services with this man, this missionary, teaching on faith. We were so challenged that evening. And the pastor got up and challenged us to put it all on the line. And in terms of a love offering. And I turned to Anne-Marie and I said, honey, what do we have in the checking account? And she said, we have $17.24. And I said, you know, honey, I am so pressed after hearing this man that we should give $17 to God. She said, I think we should give the $17.24. I said, don't be silly. God's not interested in change. Because he doesn't do anything with change, does it? I mean, he doesn't kill 5,000 Philistines, 5,005. He only kills 5,000. He doesn't feed 3,004. He always deals with, even numbers. And she says, no, we need to give it all. Now, $17 doesn't sound like much today, but I want you to know, $17, oh, that would take us through the whole week. I mean, that would buy a grocery cart worth of food. I mean, that was plenty of money. But we were young Christians, and maybe naive, but we were so taken by this challenge to give it all to God. And I'm sure that sense, that feeling, that challenge has been before every one of you. And you had to wrestle through it. And so we wrote a check for $17.24. We gave it all. And we didn't have a savings account to, fall back on. We didn't have any CDs or anything like that. The next morning in the mail, ladies and gentlemen, there was a U.S. Treasury check for $34.48. Now, if it was just $34, ladies and gentlemen, it's a coincidence. But it was $34.48, and it's not a coincidence. That is a memorial in our life, and it shall ever be. That is God showing His faithfulness for our faithfulness. How did it even happen? Years earlier, I worked for the Veterans Administration. Low-wage earner. There was a pay raise that went through at the time. It was vetoed by President Nixon. It was taken to court, challenged as to the legitimacy of that veto. It was held up in courts for years. It was overturned, and the courts ordered the Veterans Administration to pay, with interest, all of those lower-end salary people. And by the time they tracked me down, it was Monday the next day with this government check for $34.48. I want you to know, people will say it's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. That is a memorial forever in our life. That didn't just happen. That is a spiritual marker. That is something we shall remember. We will tell you the story again of what our great God has done and what our great God has taught us. Let me give you a second memorial. This is an interesting one. It's the memorial of prayer. The memorial of prayer. Many years ago, when my daughter Amy was about 9 years of age, she wanted a pair of sneakers. That was the new and upcoming sneaker. Back in the early 70s, there was nothing really fancy. There was no LA Gear. There was no Reeboks. The first pair of sneakers that was different than Kmart that came out of the chute that was everyone wanted was in fact Nike. That was the different name. Everyone wanted Nike sneakers, and my kids were no different than your kids. My kids came to us because all the other kids in school had it, and Amy came at 9 years of age and says, Dad, Mom, would you buy me a pair of Nike sneakers? And we said, Nike sneakers, Amy? They're almost $15. We couldn't afford a pair of Nike sneakers. And she said so innocently, she says, well, would you mind if I asked God for them? And we said, well, sure, kid, go ahead. God's not in the sneaker business, but you go practice your prayer. And so she faithfully did. She practiced her prayer. It was about 4 days later, we were coming home from church, drove down our long driveway. We were all getting out of the car when we noticed there was a brown paper bag on our porch. So we went over to the brown paper bag and had the name Amy on it. We opened up the brown paper bag, and there was a shoe box. Inside the shoe box was a brand new pair of Nike sneakers for her. We did what you probably would do. We called Amy over here, said, honey, now listen, Mom and Dad need a new car. You start praying, honey. You start praying. You know, kind of like rubber, like a genie. Come on, baby, we got 2 or 3 more in there. I mean, how did that happen? How did that happen? My sister-in-law, who could very well afford a pair of Nike sneakers, bought a pair, tried them on one time, didn't like them. Anne-Marie's mom was down visiting, who lives up near us, down visiting. And my sister-in-law said to Anne-Marie's mom, I bought this pair of sneakers, don't care for them. You know someone they may fit? My mother-in-law said, well, what size are they? She said, that's Amy's size. Let me take them up, see if she wants them. Took them up, left them on. People will say, ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully. Coincidence. I want you to know in the Ezzo family, it was no coincidence. That was the day, the moment, when a 9-year-old girl taught her mom and dad about how big her God is. That was the moment when a little girl taught us how to pray. That was a memorial, and is a memorial in our life that we will never forget. That the believing faith of a 9-year-old little girl was so powerful. Her God was so big, and our God was so small. And she simply reminded us of the truth that James gives us, that you have not because you ask not. Which, by the way, you ask not because it's an issue of faith, not remembrance. You don't believe your God is big enough. In our family, this is a memorial, the memorial of prayer. Number 3, there's a memorial of God's leading. We'll never forget this. This is the memorial of God's leading. We were living in New England. I was going to come out to do the graduate work out here in Southern California. We were going to rent our house for 2 years. That was our plan. And so we knew that what we wanted to do was sort of like speed up the process in going through seminary. Anne-Marie would work full-time. The kids were approaching the teen years. We would try to do this as a team and rush back to New England. God had other plans, of course. But in preparing for this, the state of California Nursing Department, Anne-Marie being an RN, had reciprocity with New Hampshire, where Anne-Marie practiced nursing. And so the only thing Anne-Marie really needed to do to get her license was to file an application, of course, and send her college transcripts. And so we filled out the application. This is in January. We were going to move in June. We filled out the application, sent it to California. We waited till sometime in March, did not hear from them. They acknowledged that they did receive, after we called them, they did receive, in fact, the application, but they never received the college transcripts. And we knew we had called the college. But we also realized colleges, universities, registrar's office, they're busy after Christmas, the new registration coming in. Everyone makes a mistake. It's not a problem. We have plenty of time. We called the college for a second time, asked them, please send out Anne-Marie's transcripts. In the middle of April, we called California, assuming this was done. California informed us that, yes, they did receive transcripts, but they received Gary Ezzo's transcripts, and that's not going to cut it for a nursing license. They need Anne-Marie Ezzo's transcripts. So, okay, listen, we can understand how secretaries make a mistake. You know, we're going right by the college. On our way to California, we will stop and make sure we have 30 days. We'll stop and make sure those transcripts are sent so Anne-Marie can have her license so she can get a job. After all, if she doesn't get a job, everything is hinging on this. We stopped by, we explained it to the registrar. They were apologetic. We explained how the 2 times that there's been a mistake. They said, you know, by the time you get to California, we'll make sure it's there. We check the address. We're assuming everything's going to be taken care of. We get to California. Anne-Marie immediately goes out and and looks for a job. She gets a nursing position, the very first hospital. In fact, she's the only applicant, and it was quite nice, but it was 11 to 7. And they asked her about her nursing license, realizing that she came from New Hampshire. She said, I'm sure it's here, it's in Sacramento, just waiting for me to call it down. We call Sacramento, we explain who we are. By now, they're really getting to know who we are. And they said, we're sorry, we have no transcripts from New York State. Now I'm upset with the registrar. How could this happen? I mean, I met with the guy. He told me it was going to happen. And of course, they're saying, no, it's someplace in the mailroom in California. She lost that job. She went for a second interview. It came up a couple of days later. It happened to be a 3 to 11, better hours rather than that night shift and every other weekend. This is 3 to 11 every other weekend, the holidays. But at least we would be together, at night, and we would be together during the day. 3 nurses applied. She was selected. We called California. California said, we're sorry, no transcript, no license. Now I'm upset with God. God, why did you bring me out here? I mean, this is a cruel joke. You have brought us this far. And Lord, when you get to heaven, you're going to ask God all kinds of questions. I'm going to ask him, Lord, where's Anne-Marie's transcripts? Because there's got to be a black hole somewhere in the universe that have Marie Ezzo's transcript. How is it that you could do miracles? You could part the Red Sea, but you can't get a transcript from New York State to California? There was a miracle job that came open. 19 nurses applied for it. 6:30 to 3, Monday through Friday. No weekends, no holidays. Right across the street from where we were to get an apartment. They went down from 19 nurses to 11 nurses. Anne-Marie was part of the 11. From the 11 nurses down to 3 nurses, Anne-Marie was part of the last 3. On the day that she was asked, do you have your license? They gave her from Friday to Monday. If not, we'll go with another nurse. On that day, when we walked home, when we walked in the door of the house that we were staying with, our host handed us an envelope. And that envelope was from Sacramento. It was Anne-Marie's nursing license. And I want you to know what happened in that moment, ladies and gentlemen. In that moment, I just had to go in the other room, fall on my knees, and to admit my shame. I'll tell you what my shame is. My shame, my faith shamed me. Not being ashamed of the faith, my faith shamed me. Here, God worked everything out. Everything. And it's that moment when that voice, whether it be audible or whether it be a voice that you hear in your heart, why can't you believe me? If you had taken that first job and the transcript was there, you would not have had my best. And if you had taken the second job, you still would not have had what I have chosen for you. My faith shamed me. You see, ladies and gentlemen, for you Christians, in the Christian life, sometimes it's confusing. I want you to know, it's okay to be confused in the Christian life. Just don't let your confusion rob you of your faith. Because confusion says, Lord, I don't know what you're doing. The lack of faith says, Lord, I don't think you know what you're doing. And that's what I was guilty of. And that's what I was ashamed of. And I had learned from that moment that voice, I have begun a good work in you. Why don't you believe me? That is a memorial of God's leading that forever will be in our life. Let me give you another memorial. This is a memorial of God's sovereign intervention. We'll never forget this. The memorial of God's sovereign intervention. We were in this apartment. We were driving home as we usually did on Sunday. We pulled off to the right-hand side where we would normally park to go into our apartment across the street. As I was driving up the street, there was a sort of a ruffian young man who began to pull out, and I just, out of courtesy and warning, I just beeped the horn to let him know I was coming. He obviously didn't see me. But apparently I startled him, and that created some anxiety in him. And as I was pulling over, as I was unbuckling my seatbelt, I could hear the squealing of the tires behind me as this guy pulled out. And he was just, for no reason, he was just zooming up the road. And my daughter, Jennifer, she had gathered her stuff off. Now, she had a blue jumper on that day. And she was gathering her stuff up. I had my hand on my door handle. She was sitting behind me. We're both ready to exit onto the street. I heard the squeal of the wheels. I turned. I saw in my rear view mirror this man coming. You could hear him. Jennifer did not. And as she began to open the door, I screamed, "No, Jennifer!" And as the car zoomed by, Jennifer's fallen back into the seat. And you turn around and you wonder what happened in the moment. And what happened in the moment, she's fussing. She's fussing. Oh. In that moment, as she was opening up the door handle, the first time and the only time it's happened in her life, as she opened the door and she began to step out, her right blue jumper strap caught the door handle and catapulted her back into the car as the other went back, and we're thinking, not coincidence. You see, I know that God intervenes in my life every single day, and He intervenes in your life every single day. I just don't know, ladies and gentlemen, when He does it. In that moment, He did it. Especially now as we look back, we wonder, where would the ministry be, if there would even be a teaching ministry, if we had buried a young teenager? Could we have dared to go on from that point? This is a memorial of God's sovereign intervention. Then there's the memorial of ministry calling. Let me share this with you. Maybe you are struggling with this. Maybe you're at this point in your own life. It's May 12th, 1973. My friend Albert and Cindy, Anne-Marie and I, we were best friends. But Albert and I loved bass fishing. I would go to Massachusetts down to where he lived. And we would fish Friday night. And we would fish early on Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon. And we would always gather around for a great dinner Saturday night. And the kids would play. They were the same ages. Albert was putting the kids to bed. Cindy was busying herself in the kitchen. Anne-Marie and I were sipping our coffee after dinner. Never forget this moment, ladies and gentlemen. Cindy turns to us because Cindy and Albert belonged to a religious system that was completely dedicated to work salvation. It was not salvation by grace, not salvation by faith, but salvation by all the good works and the accumulation of good works. And as she was busying herself, she just turned to us and nonchalantly really said, "Gary and Anne-Marie, have you heard the good news?" And good news, what are you saying, Cindy? Are you expecting what good news? Something wonderful happened? And she says, no. She said, have you two heard the good news of Jesus Christ? That salvation is a free gift of God, and that salvation is yours by faith. That's the good news of the gospel. And Anne-Marie and I were stunned. We were Christians. We were baby Christians. We were stunned. We said, Cindy, what are you saying? You and Albert, you're Christians? And she said, yes. She said, Albert and I gave our lives over to Jesus Christ, and we want to share the good news with you. This is the first time we've been together, and we want to share with you how you too can have salvation. And we said, Cindy, we're Christians too. Isn't that great? And Cindy's words that came out of her mouth were the words that changed our life forever. Because in that moment, when the fullness and the realization of what we said hit her, she turned with tears coming down her eyes. She said, here, we are best friends. And you too are going to let us burn in hell. You kept the secret all the time. It was in that moment, ladies and gentlemen, that Anne-Marie and I were taken by God, somehow, we don't understand it, slammed against the wall. And the only thing we heard, again, figuratively from our hearts, surrender now, completely. I'm about to begin a work in you. People ask us, when did your ministry start? When you got to California, when you had your first class? When you did your first videos and the first 100 videos went out? When did your ministry start? Ladies and gentlemen, our ministry started in Burlington, Massachusetts on May 12th, 1973, when someone who loved us so much was not ashamed to give the gospel and was willing to risk all the years of friendship that we would know the message of eternity in Jesus Christ. Do your neighbors know you're Christian? Do the people you work with know you're Christian? How about those friends that you see every 6 months like we saw Cindy and Al? Do they know you're Christians? It was in that moment that our life was changed, and it's that date, that moment, in fact, is a memorial in our life forever. We will tell you the story again. Then finally, ladies and gentlemen, for our family, although there may be others, this is one I want to share with you. There is the memorial of the martyrs of the faith. The memorial of the martyrs of the faith. Do you remember the martyrs of the faith? Have you read about them? Do you know what happened to them? May I remind you how Nero would take sometimes children that could not be sold into slavery, sometimes families, sometimes men and women and husbands and wives, and how he would cover them with pitch, and how he would have them with metal strapped to the post, Christians lining the city, and then at night he would set them aflame. And gentlemen, may I just bring this to your attention, that the screams of your children and your wife were so great that in fact you couldn't even feel the flames eating away at your own skin because the pain, emotional pain, was too great to bear. And what about the children and the Christians that were fed to the lions? It's one thing to be attacked in the wilderness by a wild beast. Moms, to have your children that were not suitable for slavery to go before you to be the morsel, for you or your husband to go before you. Listen, and to have the crowd, thousands cheering for your blood. Have you forgotten the martyrs and those who have gone before you? In our family, we don't want to forget those who have set the pace for the gospel. We don't want to forget those who were burnt at the stake, and so many times the fires went out, and they would be suffering in agony as part of their limbs would be burnt off, and yet they would still be alive begging for someone to kill them. But I think of all of the martyrs of all of the ages, there is none that is more fitting to our memorials than one little girl from a distant island in the Philippines. The story really starts with our friend Christine Davis. She's the most amazing young lady. 19 years old, she came to the Lord. She knew immediately, not even being able to understand or comprehend the theology of it, that she was called to bring the gospel to people who never heard it. Christine Davis applied in a very naive way. No Bible college, no seminary training. She wanted to be a missionary, so she went to a mission agency, and they basically said, you can't be a missionary. I mean, first of all, you don't have any Bible college, and you don't have any cross-cultural experience. You don't have a master's degree in biblical anthropology. You can't be a missionary. You're just not qualified. And yet in her heart, she knew she was. She had the burden to bring the gospel message. And so she took their advice. She went away for a year, got some Bible training, good Bible training. She got her Old Testament, New Testament, the life of Christ. She went back. The agency said, no, we can't even put you into a short-term mission. Why don't you get plugged into some other local church that has a bigger mission program? And well, Christine just poured her heart out to the Lord. And she asked the Lord, Lord, direct me. And so the Lord directed her to Manila. She bought a one-way ticket by faith to Manila. And then eventually she found herself in a small village. As God had, only God could do, directed her life. I want you to know in the end, she led over 500 people to the Lord, established 5 churches, and to this day, both her and her husband, in fact, are continuing to support men that come out of these small villages, train them in Manila in the Bible school, and send them back to church plant. Her story is amazing, and her story will come out in a book soon. But in one of her stories, Christine shared with us one of the most moving stories of a commitment to Christ and martyrdom. And I want to share with you right from Christine's words. If you would bear with me, please, as I go through this. We're picking it up now with Christine speaking. One day after a Bible study session, I noticed a young girl sitting on a bench near the building. I smiled at her. She was absolutely gorgeous. I asked in her native tongue, "What's your name?" "Leah," she answered. "Would you like to come inside, Leah?" She seemed a little unsure and shook her head no. I told her that she is welcome any time. If she changed her mind, she smiled back warmly. Over the next few weeks, I often saw Leah hanging out near the church, but every time I asked her if she would like to come in, she would smile nicely and say no. I decided to stop asking her for a while and let her come if she wanted to. A couple of more weeks went by and I hadn't seen her. She was on my mind and I couldn't shake it. There was something about that little girl that I wanted to draw to. She was 8 years old. She had beautiful, long, straight hair, black as night. Her eyes were beautiful, dark brown. They looked sad, though. It seemed as though, even with her eyes, she was trying to tell me that she needed help, but she couldn't ask. She looked like a Filipino Precious Moments doll, if there is even such a thing. I began to ask around if anyone knew where Leah lived. One of the ladies that had fruit stand near the church said she knew, and she told me. The little girl lives next to the barrio. Her father's a drunk. He often beats on the mother and even on the little girl. Then he goes off for weeks at a time, leaving them. That's when we'll see the little girl just hanging around. It made sense to me now. I had seen the hurt in her eyes. Why wasn't I more persistent? I could tell there was something wrong in her little heart. She was not anywhere to be found. No one had seen her. I decided to go to the barrio to help with first aid in hopes of seeing her. No luck that day. Everywhere I went, I was partially keeping an eye out for Leah. She's got to show up somewhere. Sunday had come, and church people did a special program of music. The singing could be heard from all around the village. I loved to look through the bamboo to see the responses on the faces of the people. Many were still not sure what we were doing. All of a sudden, my eyes spotted Leah. There she was on the same bench that she always sat on. As soon as the next song was over, I went out and sat next to her. "I'm not going to ask you if you want to come in today. No, I'm not going to do that. Of course, you can if you want to come in, Leah, but I'm not going to ask you." She just smiled. I think she thought I was funny. She looked at me like most young girls do, with a gaze in their eyes. I looked so different to them. I sat and I talked for the remaining of the singing. I asked her many questions, and she finally relaxed and started to talk to me. She told me that her mother worked at the marketplace and that her father is sick. When I pressed for her for more information, she finally let me into what was going on in her heart and her home. "My father's a drunk. He drinks a lot, and I never know when he will drink too much. That is when I do not want to go home. Sometimes he will hurt my mother, and he hurts me too. He always feels badly after, but he keeps doing it. I do not know where to go, so I come here. I like to listen to the music. It makes me feel better inside." I felt like taking her to live with me. What could I do to help this little girl? I picked her up into my lap and I told her story. The children are singing in there because they're happy about something. They know Jesus. God in heaven sent His Son Jesus to earth to suffer and die on the cross for our sins. Jesus, Leah, knows a lot about suffering. We talked for a long time, and then Leah looked up at me and said, "I'd like to go inside now." There was not much time left, but she was able to hear part of the message and joined in the singing at the end. Leah then accepted Jesus into her heart and was very excited to learn all about God. She was particularly interested in God being her Father. She loved to listen to stories from the Bible and talk about heaven and how God was preparing a mansion for all of us someday to live in. Sometimes we would guess what it would be like to live in a home that had been built by God and what it would be like to live with God. Leah loved to sing, and it was not long before she knew all the words to all the songs. She made my heart glad to see a smile on her face and to hear her laughing with the other kids. I began to fall in love with her. I gave her a little dress, a white dress, as a sign of my affection. The next Sunday had come, and Leah did not show up for church. I went looking for her, but she wasn't home. I finally found her at the marketplace. "Is everything all right, Leah?" She told me, "My father's at home, and my mother thought it would upset him if he knew I was going to church, so I just came here with my mother. When he found out that I had been coming to your church, he was not happy, and he was growing more angry. The witch doctor has great power over my father. That night was a special service for our church. I was there helping prepare lessons when all of a sudden I heard someone screaming my name. Christina, Christina, come quickly. What is it? I asked as I ran outside to see who was coming for me. It's Leah. She's been hurt. I grabbed my bag as fast as I could and I ran as fast as my legs would take me. I hollered for Joe to fetch the barrio captain and to meet us at Leah's hut. I felt like I was in a dream trying to run but not going nearly as fast as I needed to go. My mind just kept flashing her sweet little face in front of me. I arrived in a panic at her hut. There was a huge crowd that I had to break my way through to get to the door. Just as I got near the door, the barrio captain was taking Leah's father away. He was staggering and drunk and screaming. I pushed my way through the door. It was chaos. Leah's mother laid on the floor, bent over, weeping. Everything that they owned was thrown all over the floor in shambles. I ran to where the beds were turned over, and I lifted it, and there was Leah, lying in a pool of blood. I burst into tears, and I leaned over to lift her up. This can't be. How can anyone do this to a child? I tried to get control of myself because I could not tell if she could see me. It looked like he had beaten her entire body. Her eyes were swollen and oozing. Blood covered her body and now mine as I lifted her off the floor. And then I realized she was wearing the little white dress that I gave her. Tears were just flooding out of me and I was broken in despair. Where do I begin? Where should I go? My mind was racing with thoughts of what should I do as I heard her little voice struggling to speak. Auntie, am I going to be okay? I held her tight and said, Leah, no matter what, you're going to be all right, honey. I wrapped her up in some blankets and gathered a crew to help me carry her out to the barrio, to a town 5 hours away. There was a small clinic. I knew that possibly that could be where our hope would be. We rigged up a board to carry her and attempted the long 5-hour trek through the jungle. There I knew a Filipino man who had a clinic. He was not always there, so we were taking a chance, but it was the only one we had. On the way there, Leah had drifted in and out. It was late and she was tired, and I kept trying to talk to her so she wouldn't go to sleep. I was afraid if she went to sleep that she would never wake up again. I felt like I was having a nightmare. This really couldn't be happening. I felt like I had to maintain control to make the long trip and for the sake of everyone else, but I just wanted to sob. I remained silent the entire trip for the exception of talking to Leah. Tears never stopped streaming from my face. I never in a million years thought that coming to the jungle region to share Jesus with these people would lead me to this moment. It was 4 a.m. when we arrived at the clinic. In a panic, I told the doctor what had happened, and he rushed over to help Leah inside. He told me to stay in the waiting room while he took her back into the treatment room. I sat and I waited what seemed to be hours. Then the door opened, and my friend gestured for me to come in. I have her all cleaned up, Christina. And then he paused. It doesn't look good. She took a real bad beating. And I'm afraid that there is nothing I can do for her. Nothing. You have to be able to do something, I said. He just looked at me with a long face. I'm sorry. She's coming in and out, and I want you to go and be with her now. She shouldn't be alone in these last moments. I opened the door, and I saw her laying there. She had a new gown on and had been all cleaned up. Her sweet little face was all dark from being hit. Her body laid still, but I could hear her breathe. I took her hand. Leah, I'm here. She turned her head and looked at me and tried to smile. Tears were pouring out of me like a river, even when I tried so hard to hold them back. I took a deep breath and I tried to talk to her. I held her little hand and I looked into her deep brown eyes. Leah, remember the mansion we talked about? I think it's just about ready for you. Jesus is right here, and he's going to take you there. She looked up at me with a long gaze. All of a sudden, I could tell that something struck her mind. She tightened her grip on my hand and asked, Christina, where's my dress? The white dress. The dress you gave me. Oh, honey, it's over there. It needs to be cleaned. No, I need it now. I didn't understand, but I went over, and I rolled it up, and I laid it on her little tummy so she could feel it. And Leah wrapped her arm around the dress and said, I need to take this with me to show, so I can show Jesus that I suffered for him and that I shed my blood just as he shed his blood for me. I covered my eyes with my hands and I wept, and then I looked up and she was gone to the presence of the Lord. If you come to our house, we have a shadow box, not very thick, covered with glass. And inside of that shadow box, we have an old government check. And a pair of shoelaces from a little girl's sneaker. And a blue jumper strap. And a very old nursing license. And a calendar date dating back to 1973. And we have a little piece of white cloth with little red markings on it. And I want you to know, when my grandchildren come over to my house and they come to the box and they will say, Grandpa, tell me the story again about my mommy and the shoelaces. And I will say, Ashley, let me tell you that story. That was the time when your mommy taught us how to pray. Oh, it happened a long time ago. And Grandpa, tell me the story again, how God saved Aunt Jenny. Tell me the story again about the blue jumper strap. Ashley, let me tell you what happened and how God intervened into our life. And Grandpa, tell me the story again about the little girl in her white dress and she wanted to give to Jesus. Oh, Ashley, that happened so long ago and so far ago. Let me tell you about that story. Ladies and gentlemen, we have these memorials because we do not want to forget the great things our God has done. May I remind you, you gentlemen, you guys are clever enough. You could build one or buy one. Let me remind you, you have children, some of you in this room and some of you yet to join us. You weren't supposed to have children. May I remind you, you have healthy children and you weren't supposed to have healthy children. You have mothers and fathers alive and they're not supposed to be alive. God worked great things in your life. Do you remember the impossible prayer that everyone prayed for you at the church and the prayer came through? God delivered. You have so many memorials in your life. But it was Moses who said, only take heed of yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. This is a great season for all of us. Christmas, New Year's. We celebrate many things, but there are the memorials of our life that we need to bring to remembrance all the time. Your God is a great God. We have already planned that when our time is done on this earth, our children inherit. They've already started their own boxes. Our children will get the shadow boxes. And you know what? If the Lord tarries generations to come, there's going to be a little boy or a little girl who's going to someday say to their mama, Mama, tell me the story again about the little girl and the shoelaces and the sneaker. And the story's going to be told. Let me tell you, honey, now that was Your great-grandmother. No, maybe that was your great-great-grandmother when she was teaching her mommy and daddy how to pray. Let me tell you how the story goes. You see, we don't want our children to ever forget what our God has done. How many things do you remember that God did in your parents' life? Now, you know what God has done in your life. And you see, the problem we have is we remember, but then we forget. Why do you think God had the stones placed on the west side of the Jordan? So when your eyes see these stones, tell the story again. That's why we need a visual reminder. That's why we have a shadow box. That's why we have these things in our shadow box. You put the same things in. There is something that will be a reminder of what your God has done, how He has delivered you. And the reason why you are to have it there is because someday I may be in your house. Someday your neighbor may be in your house. And God wants you to tell the story again of the mighty works of your Lord. Memorials. Concept originated by God. Now something that we need to make part of our life. Do it. Do it for your children.